So just recently here at Messiah, we started a new sermon series where we're going to be working through the whole Bible in the span of about a year. And in Bible class, then we're going to take up whatever book we're on, and we're going to study into that a little bit deeper. So we want to encourage everyone to be reading in those books, you know, even if you don't go through every chapter of every book, that's fine. We want you to be reading in these books and to kind of help you along so that you can kind of get a bird's eye view of what each book is all about and try to remember that, and it can kind of guide you as you're going through that book. We're going to try to provide some videos like this one where we're going to look at the whole thing. So here is kind of a little chart to help us through the book of Genesis. Now, the book of Genesis breaks down into two basic parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, where you see the ancient world and you see God interacting with the ancient world as a whole. Okay? And then after that, then chapters 12 through 50, we see God interacting with this chosen family of Abraham's family. This is the family that the Savior is going to come from, the Messiah is going to come from. So if we look back at those verses or chapters 1 through 11, we see a lot of beginnings, and that's what the book of Genesis actually means. Like the name Genesis means beginnings, and so back in these chapters, we see the creation of everything, the beginning of everything. We see the fall into sin. We see the first promise. We see the first sacrifice. We see the first clothing. We see the first marriage. We see just all of these different beginnings. We see the first murder. We see the first culture gaps after the Tower of Babel, when all these groups go out with different languages because they can't communicate with each other. So we see a lot of beginnings in this book, right in the first 11 chapters. Now, one really important beginning that we see too is right here in chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. We have the first promise of the Savior. So Adam and Eve had disobeyed God, they had sinned against him, and right away he says, I'm not going to destroy you, I'm not going to destroy everything, I'm not going to start again, I'm going to send you someone who's going to destroy the devil's power. And he doesn't give Adam and Eve a lot of information about what this Messiah is going to do and how he's going to do it and who he's going to be. But as we move through the books of the Old Testament toward Jesus' birth, we start to get more and more specific prophecies about what the Messiah is going to be like. All right, so you might have noticed I got a little box there with a cross in it. So when you see that in other places here too, those are also places where the Messiah is mentioned. These aren't all of the ones in Genesis, but here are some of them. So some of the first major events, we've got the fall into sin, first promise, we got the great flood, and then kind of like the beginning again of the world when the ark lands, and then we've got the Tower of Babel, which I mentioned already. So then in the second half of Genesis, we go into chapters 12 through 50, and we start kind of like that bird's eye view has zoomed down. And now we're a little bit closer to everything going on, and we see this man Abraham and his family and God interacting with him. Now, God chose Abraham and his family to be the family that the Messiah would come from, but he didn't choose them because they were better than everyone else or anything about them. He simply chose Abraham because of his grace. All right? This promise, he promises Abraham a couple times here, Abraham, I'm going to bless everyone in the world through your family. And then that promise gets passed on to his son Isaac, and then it gets passed on to his son Jacob. And so this promise is being passed down in this chosen family. Now, these have crosses in them, but this one doesn't, because this one isn't a prophecy of the Messiah. It's kind of a verse that helps to kind of help us see like a theme that happens throughout Genesis, and that is that over and over mankind is shown to be untrustworthy and sinful, and yet then God is shown to be trustworthy and gracious. That is, he loves man even though man doesn't deserve it, and he's doing something about rescuing man. All right, so this passage is where Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and they intended that, they almost murdered him, but instead they threw him in a pit and then sold him as a slave. So this is a very bad thing. They intended it for evil. And Joseph says, finally, you guys intended this for evil, but God intended it for good. Because what actually happened was Joseph became a very high official in Egypt, and he provided, through God's wisdom, for a lot of people to have food in a time of famine. And he eventually brought his whole family down to Egypt to kind of set up the next chapter in the history of the world, where we've got Moses and the children of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, in Egypt under slavery. And we're going to get into that in the book of Exodus. So that's kind of a bird's eye view of all the things that are happening in the book of Genesis. So I hope that helps you to kind of get a view of the book and helps you to put things in their place as you're moving through that book. So may God bless your study of His Word as we move forward.